My name is Amy Forbes. I'm the director of the Centennial Center for Leadership, Entrepreneurship, and Innovation, and I'm joined by my awesome colleague, Lisa Kaenzig, who most of you know is Dean of William Smith Colleges. One of the signature qualities of these programs that Alumni House have been planning is...
Amy, you're muted. I think you might have hit something there. Sorry. It wouldn't be a Zoom webinar if we didn't have that happen.
There we go. Small glitch. You need to hear me. I was saying that this is a great collaboration forged by Alumni House, but brought to you from the Centennial Center as well as William Smith Dean's Office. And we're going to share with you a really important, I think, leadership topic. We're going to look at the legacy of a phenomenal leader in our midst, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. As many of you know, we've been sort of looking back over her storied career. And Lisa is a great expert in a number of her milestones within her personal as well as professional journey. So we've been having a great time planning this. As I mentioned to Lisa, I'm teaching a leadership theory class currently with a great group of HWS students. And our charge there is to really look at theory. And so when we were assessing the life of RBG, we really thought authentic leadership very much so applied. It's a very timely and relevant theory that was really forged in the 1980s that still very much applies today. And so I'm going to break down some of the components of the theory to start. And then Lisa is really going to take us through some of these great moments, both personally and professionally, which I think is really great. She's got some awesome pictures to really talk about her legacy and what she means to us. And then we're going to wrap it up and take some questions. We've already fielded some questions from the audience. We want to tackle those towards the end. And if you have ones as you listen, please do send them. But just want to mention, I'm so delighted that you all would take your lunch hour with us. This is going to be a lot of fun. So my slides are, there we go. Just a bit of a quote from Bill George, who wrote True North, which is a great source on authentic leadership, but they are genuine people that are true to themselves and what they believe. Rather than letting the expectations of others guide them, they are really prepared to be their own person and go their own way. They are constantly looking for ways to grow personally. Authentic leaders develop genuine connections and engender trust. That's a really compelling statement. I think one that whether you're an alum or a faculty, staff, or student and thinking about how you want to further your own authentic leadership, it really is about being yourself. We're going to discuss a little bit, Lisa and I, as we've planned, what are some of the barriers and challenges of being who you really want to be, especially in a leadership role, but that's really the essence of the theory. There are 5 dimensions, which I think are really going to stand out to you, particularly as we move into the legacy of RBG, but they are pursuing a purpose with passion. This is something that I get really excited about. I know Lisa does too in all of her mentoring of students. When they stumble onto what they really are passionate about, all of a sudden the work becomes quite easy and effortless. And so that's a really big component of being authentic. It's finding out what you feel really strongly about, and then looking for ways in which you can align with a purpose that allows you to exercise that passion. Practicing solid values. This is something that we talk about quite significantly in the class I'm teaching right now. I've long said that I don't teach values at this age with the traditional college student. Their parents, their guardians, their coaches and early teachers were doing the teaching. I help them crystallize and clarify values at this age. And many of you, especially the alums on the call, probably can speak to how very important it is to really be solid in your footing as far as your values goes, particularly when you come upon dilemmas and crises in your leadership work. So that's very important to authentic leadership. This next one is significant as well, and Lisa and I spoke quite a bit about Ruth Bader Ginsburg with regards to leading with heart. This means that you understand that we're all human beings and we come with a range of emotions. So we show up to work differently based on our experiences, especially in our home lives, with our relationships, our spouses, our friends. All of that matters, and it makes us up of who we are. And so leading with that understanding is what the leading of the heart really means. And I think Lisa's got some anecdotes that really touch on how that's who Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. Establishing connected relationships. This is very important. I know we spend a lot of time with our college students, cultivating their relationships, building their network. In my 10 years at HWS, that's what's so special about this place, especially our alum and parent network, and how ready and willing they are to help our college students when they're taking on projects, they're looking for internships, and then later as they graduate and move into the working world. But that couldn't be more important to authentic leaders. And last, and this one is big, demonstrating self-discipline. However, you are engaging in and around a practice, you do so daily in the short as well as long term. This is an area that I think Lisa and I can say our college students are learning, especially with balancing of 4 courses and all the roles they have on campus, what self-discipline looks like, and that transfers really well into the working world. I'll just touch on this one slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa in a moment to break that down some more. But authentic leadership has really transformed how we view leadership because of our rapidly changing work environments, globalization, our interconnectedness due to technology. We can't look at leadership in the same way we once did. So on the right-hand side is the more traditional ways we used to model leadership, and authentic leadership has really shaped our future, I think. We want to lead with a purpose, not necessarily just tangible goals. We want to lead with values and principles, and we want to let go of our selfish agendas. We want to lead with heart, as I've touched on already, kind of guarding against our ego. We really want to spend time cultivating those long-term relationships as opposed to just transactions. And we definitely want to demonstrate that self-discipline as opposed to using power and authority only. These are the ways in which authentic leadership has really shaped how we want to build and grow our leaders moving on into their professional roles. So now we get to the really exciting component, I think, and this is how Lisa is going to story for us some of these major milestones that RBG is known for. She's going to touch on some personal as well as professional components, and you'll see the linkage that we both found when it comes to authentic leadership and her legacy. So I'm going to pass it over to my co-facilitator right now.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate that. I'm so happy to be with all of you on this last Monday in Women's History Month. Thanks to those of you who hung with us as we needed to reschedule a few weeks ago. I'm sorry we weren't able to do that on that day. That was actually the birthday of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on March 15th, and there was a statue, as many of you know, being unveiled in Brooklyn, her home community. So a lot of you are also probably aware and may have tuned in last month in early February, on February 3rd, for the absolutely amazing colleges giving the prestigious Blackwell Award to Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the anniversary of Dr. Blackwell's 200th birthday. And if you were with us, you know that her children, Jane and James, were there to accept the award on behalf of their mother. It was really special. If you have not seen it, you can view it on the HWS webpage. If you just type in Elizabeth Blackwell's 200th birthday celebration, our Office of Communications did a beautiful job with many things related to Dr. Blackwell's 200th birthday, but certainly on there you can see the video right at the top of the award being given on behalf of her children for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I highly recommend that. And if you were part of that and you want to watch it, you'll hear more about the very special relationship that she had with the colleges, because when she was an undergraduate at Cornell in the early 1950s, her cousin was an undergraduate here at Hobart College, here at the colleges. And so they had a lot of time in the car, driving back and forth, carpooling together back to New York City. And she got to hear a lot about this special place. And so that's why it really meant a lot to us to give that award honoring her. So I'm really happy that you're here with us, and delighted to share some of the things I love the most. I absolutely adore Justice Ginsburg and have read an awful lot about her. And like many of you, I have seen both the fantastic documentary about her life, as well as the fictionalized account of part of her life on the basis of sex. And if you haven't seen either or both of those, I highly recommend that you do so. So we'll go to the first picture. So I love this picture. Some of you may have seen it. This is obviously on the right, Justice Ginsburg, and on the left, her husband, Marty, when they were quite young with their first child, Jane, who was about a year and a half here. This was just before they actually moved to Cambridge, where they started law school together. Well, actually, he started first. He was a year ahead of her at Harvard Law School before later they went to Columbia. But she was really nervous about starting law school. And this is a story that not as many people know about her, but this sort of sets some of the stage for that extraordinary determination that she had, that so many of you know about, and the self-discipline for which she's famous, and certainly, as Amy said, is one of the trademark characteristics of folks who are authentic leaders, which she is absolutely an exemplary model of. And she was so nervous about starting law school and having a very young child. And her father-in-law told her shortly after Jane was born, and she was so concerned about whether she could balance having a very young child with being in law school. And again, this is the late 1950s. And he said, and I'm going to quote him here, "If you really want to go to law school, Ruth, you will stop feeling sorry for yourself and you will find a way to do it." So tough love. Some of us, her parents, know that feeling. And so she has always told people, especially young people, her entire life, that your attitude should be, she would say, that you are going to find a way to do what you want to do. And I think that sums up so well what a very young, is in that picture, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was feeling at that time. They ended up hiring a terrific babysitter who was there at the house with them Monday through Friday, 8 to 4. And she has famously also said that that time was her time to go to law school classes to get her own work done. And then at 4 o'clock, when the babysitter left, from 4 until she went to bed, that was Jane's time. And she would do nothing but focus solely on Jane, with that extraordinary focus that we all know her to be famous for in her legal work later in her life and career. But that was the time that she spent with Jane. And then also certainly another testament to her extraordinary determination and ability to somehow magically at times, I think, balance her career and her family life was when her husband, Marty, very young, became very ill with cancer. And he was just starting his 3rd year of law school. She was just starting her 2nd year of law school. And so she had to balance not only having a young child, but having a very sick young husband, both of them in law school. And that's when she started to not sleep very much at night, because she'd be trying to do her work, also help him with his work, and take care of their young child. So she just had an extraordinarily early start to learning how to focus in her life and career. Some of you may also be aware that her mother passed away when Ruth was only 17 years old. And that was a huge issue for her, of course, and something that changed the trajectory of her life and her way of thinking about being a mother, certainly, as well later on. And her mother, she always said, had told her when she was young that she needed to focus on blocking unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and remorse. And she said those were words that just continued to ring in her ears for the rest of her life, that she had to learn how to black out those emotions. And I think that that's a real testament to many people who end up being successful in their career. You'll hear people sometimes talk about the ability to compartmentalize. I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg was an extraordinary model for that. Sometimes that's harder for most of us than it certainly was for her. But she would always say that that helped her learn how to focus on the things she needed to focus on, that she wanted to do in her work and in her personal life, and not spend as much energy on the emotions that were more difficult for her to manage. So we'll go to the next picture now, which again, some of you may have seen before and published in a couple of books. And that is the importance of the choice of a life partner. And I think we all, many of us, understand the benefits of that. I know I certainly do. As this is a very young Ruth and Marty, shortly after they were married, but they first met at Cornell in the fall of 1950. He saw her on campus. She did not know who he was. She didn't really pay attention to him. I think she is famous for saying, but he convinced his roommate, who was dating one of her close friends at the time, to set them up on a blind date, to set him and Ruth Bader Ginsburg up on, at that time, just Ruth Bader, on a blind date. And they really hit it off right from the beginning and were famously close right away, as their friends at Cornell at the time certainly would have told any of us. She said, he was the only guy I ever dated who cared whether I had a brain. So a good choice, I think, for all of us. Let us choose partners that care that we have a brain. And as she also said about him, which was certainly true, he was just so damn smart. Many of you may be aware he went on to have a very famous career in tax law and was one of the top tax attorneys in the entire country for all of his career. And so they both managed to find a way to really support one another. And I think in my own work, looking at successful women, and a couple of studies I've done of women who are top achievers in politics and top achievers in science, this was a theme that has come up over and over and over again, which is this importance of a life partner, choosing someone who is going to support you in your career goals, to join you in raising your family if you're choosing to do that, and how important that was certainly in her life and of course in his. You know, he was just an extraordinarily supportive person to her. He was her biggest cheerleader, as he used to say. They were together for 60 years, married for 56 years, until he passed away from cancer in 2010. And just a remarkable model, I think, for an extraordinary partnership. Some of you also might know that he was actually the person that led the campaign, not quietly, in Washington, D.C., to make sure she was going to be on the short list, in his words, preferably at the top of the short list for President Clinton in 1993 when he was choosing a new Supreme Court justice. Marty campaigned heavily in the legal community, in the media community there. He was absolutely determined to see his wife, who was then a justice on the US Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia, to be on the short list for the Supreme Court. He told many of his friends and other colleagues that he thought there was nobody smarter than Ruth and that she absolutely should be the person to do that. So I think we largely have Marty Ginsburg to thank, obviously, in addition to Ruth herself, for her extraordinary career, as well as that important appointment to the Supreme Court that allowed so many of us to know who she was. So I just love the story of them. I love the story of them meeting. I love how much they supported each other. And then this next picture, thanks Amy, perfect, is this idea of how important it is to have unique friendships that give us different perspectives. And I think we all certainly know right now, particularly in our political climate in this country and also around the world, how important it is to have friends in our lives, period, but also those who have differences from us. Perhaps who grew up differently, maybe have different political perspectives than we have a different way of looking at the world. I know in my own life, this has been very important. It's one of the most rewarding parts of my own work, is getting to know students who are different from me. And I think that this example of this friendship between Justice Scalia, who she knew as Nino Scalia, and Justice Ginsburg is just an extraordinary example of that. And I love this picture so much when they're dressed up, obviously, for their role in an opera, which some of you may have seen some of the footage of. But you can just see how much they're having fun, how much they enjoyed one another's company. Many people think that they became friends after they were on the Supreme Court together, but actually they'd been friends for probably 10, 15 years before she joined the court. They had been serving together as justices on the US Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit in Washington, DC. And despite their differences, they had such a joint love of the law, of the US Constitution, which she talked about a lot, he talked about a lot, little different ways of thinking about what that looked like for each of them. But they certainly did have an extraordinary relationship. And she said that was based both on the love of the law, the love of the Constitution, the love of their own profession, certainly, but also a shared sense of humor and a love of the opera. And many of you have certainly heard the stories about that. But there was actually an opera written about them, which there's some footage of this online. If you've not seen it before, it's called Scalia Ginsburg, one of the most famous, sometimes people call it kind of a subheading, but it's really the most famous song, and it is called "We Are Different, We Are One." And Ruth Bader Ginsburg quoted it all the time, but it is literally an opera about their friendship, about their connections, about the ways that they look at the world so differently, particularly about the law and the US Constitution, but this extraordinary love that they have. And it was written by Derek Wang, very famous composer now. But at that time, when he wrote it, he was a law student at University of Maryland. And so I just love that story. And they were just so extraordinarily excited to have it. He actually had it performed first quietly at the Supreme Court, where they heard it for the first time. And then it was performed, obviously, publicly many, many times, and has been ever since. But many people don't realize that Justice Scalia, who at that point was on the Supreme Court in the early 90s, was a big factor in the reason why Ruth Bader Ginsburg ended up being appointed nominated by President Clinton, and then appointed to be on the Supreme Court with him. He was having lunch with several of the law clerks a few months before the appointment was announced, and he was talking to them about various things. And at the end, he asked if they had any questions. They had all kinds of questions about the law, but they also had some kind of fun questions. And one of them was that they asked him, if you were stranded on a desert island, which of these famous people would you want to be stranded in? And the two people they asked him about were Mario Cuomo, who at that time was the governor of New York, the father of the current governor of New York, of course, or Lawrence Tribe, who is a very famous and still is professor at Harvard Law School, law professor, and a very famous legal scholar. And in fact, some of his legal assistants while they were at Harvard Law School included Elena Kagan, who's of course now on the Supreme Court, and Barack Obama, which some of you may have heard of, who some of you may have heard of before. But he didn't say either of them. He immediately answered neither of them, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He said that's who he would want to be stranded on a desert island with. That ended up, of course, leaking out to the press, was written about in an editorial in the New Republic magazine, and of course led to, as part of this campaign to convince President Clinton to nominate her to the court. So I just love that story. I love their friendship. I think it's such an important example to all of us of the importance of knowing how great it is to surround ourselves with people that think differently than us. It can be hard. I think particularly these days, it can be a little bit hard to do that, to particularly think about people and connections with people who think politically different from us. But I think it's really never been more important than it is now. So that's one of my favorite pictures. But if we could go to the next one, Amy, thanks. And of course, this is the person that so many of us know, right? And that young people particularly know. The icon with certainly the most authentic sense of herself, most authentic sense of her own leadership of anyone I've ever known or read about. She said something wonderful. People say to her, "Wow, you made such a difference in your career," particularly for women's rights, human rights, LGBT rights, et cetera. And her quote, which I love so much, which I think is so important, is that she said, "I was tremendously fortunate to be born at the right time and at the right place. Women generations before me said the same thing my generation was saying, but they did so at a time when no one was prepared to listen." And she was always so careful to give credit to the many women and men who had come before her, who had really campaigned for equality in the law, but had not been heard, had not been able to get their cases heard before the Supreme Court, had not had their voices heard. And she had this absolutely incredible self-discipline, which I talked earlier about, where a lot of that had come from. One of the famous stories in her later years at the court, about 3 years ago, I think it was, her law clerks wanted to throw a birthday party for her, and they all filtered into her office with a cake. And she was completely engrossed in working on a brief for the court at her desk, and had not even become aware until about 25 people were standing in her chambers with a birthday cake that they were even in the room. That was her ability to focus, even at her advanced age at this point. She was, as I think we all know, anyone who's seen her even speak for a few minutes, she was just extraordinary in that way. But she was really tickled by the notorious RBG thing that came about, later in her career. She just loved it. She loved that she and the rapper for whom they kind of named her there brought the connections, both from Brooklyn. She said that over and over and over again. For those of you from Brooklyn, I think you'll probably understand that. but she just loved talking with young people. And here she is at an audience, thousands of people actually in an auditorium. And she was just so funny. I mean, if you ever seen footage of her, she was absolutely hysterical, and had such a great, dry, smart sense of humor. A lot of fun to watch. And I'm sure this has interested you today to join us for this webinar because of her. And I encourage you to go online and see some of the great things that she said. But there's great footage of her watching some of the Saturday Night Live episodes where they, sort of mimic her. But she just got such a kick out of it. She just loved it. She loved all of the sort of media around it, and thought it was a great way to draw attention to the needs of others, as she had done her entire career. So I just love this picture of her. I chose this one instead of one with the collar and everything, which everyone knows, like in the book behind me that a lot of you are aware of. Those great collars of hers, which are just famous, and they're doing museum pieces of those now. But she just really loved this. She loved sitting there and talking with people and really being herself. And she also usually wore a lot of bold colors when she was off of the court. And I just think she was a really neat person. So, and then this final picture, which is bittersweet. Many of you saw this after she passed away and was laying in state at the Capitol building. All of her law clerks lined up, as many as were able to make it there, and pay tribute to her. And this is one of the things I think is so important. And it's the last picture of these five that we have here. She was such an important mentor to so many people. All of these law clerks, so many other people in her life, certainly friends and family and everybody else. But one of my favorite books about her, which I just wanted to show you, is Jeffrey Rosen's. This is called Conversations with RBG. I highly, highly recommend it. Jeffrey Rosen is the current president of the National Constitution Center. He's also a law professor at George Washington University in Washington. And he actually, the way he met Justice Ginsburg, I just love this story, so I have to share it with you. You can read more about it in the book. But 1991, he was a very new and very young law clerk at the U.S. Court of Appeals in D.C. And he got into an elevator, and on the next floor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg got into the elevator. It was just the two of them. And you'll love this part, those of you who were around in the 1990s. She had just come from a jazzercise class in the building. And so she was in her exercise gear and everything, which most people know exercise was a very big part of her life. And he said he was just so in awe. He didn't know what to say to her. He just stood there kind of dumbfounded, not knowing what to say, because she was already pretty well known at that point, but not yet, of course, on the Supreme Court, but a relatively well-known judge there, certainly at the U.S. Court of Appeals. He really wanted to talk to her, but he had no idea what to say. He'd heard through the grapevine that she loved opera. That's, of course, again, before it was so famous. So he started to talk to her about his own love of opera. And of course, they immediately connected. And they had this long, long friendship. And she was a mentor to him for many, many years, ever since that elevator conversation in 1991. So my students who are watching today, make sure if you're in an elevator with someone famous, find something to talk about. Don't waste that opportunity. You could end up with a 25, 30-year wonderful mentoring relationship with somebody fantastic. So good for him for finding the courage to talk with her while she was in her jazzercise clothes. But the conversations that he had with her, not just in that elevator, but for a long, long time after that, were recorded in this book, Conversations with RBG. He talked to her many times in front of audiences and privately. She allowed him to record her. It is just absolutely extraordinary to sort of read her own words when she was talking and having conversation with him. But he is also a person who played a role in her nomination to the court. So again, they met in 1991. A little bit later after that, after he was done clerking, he was working for several publications, including the New Republic. You might have heard me mention that editorial earlier, in which the story about Justice Scalia is also mentioned, where he was saying he'd rather be trapped on a desert island with Ruth Bader Ginsburg than anyone else. And Jeffrey Rosen wrote about his, as a legal scholar in Washington, his top 7 list of who he thought President Clinton should nominate to the court there in 1993. And he said that he thought Ruth Bader Ginsburg should be at the top of it. And just a few weeks later is when President Clinton ended up announcing the nomination. So she was just such an important mentor to so many people. And of course, many of them ended up paying it forward. And all these law clerks are a great example of that. But there are so many different stories of her, being able to write a personal note to law clerks, to other people that she was mentoring in her life. She was deeply empathetic. And I think, certainly for many, many reasons, but when she was asked about this by Jeffrey Rosen, actually a couple different times in front of audiences, he said, you're well known for your empathy and sending notes to people. In fact, just after she had returned to her first public event after having cancer, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, she saw Jeffrey Rosen and she had a note for him with her because his mother had just passed away. And it was a very thoughtful note about, her sympathy for him and how his mother would have been proud of him. I mean, just really a lovely note. And he was so amazed. He said, how do you have time to be writing all these personal notes? And where does that empathy come from? Because she was also well known to really get to know the folks she was representing in all the famous cases, particularly in the 70s and 80s, that when she argued before the court on behalf of many plaintiffs, she got to know them well. She stayed connected with them. And he said, where does that come from? Not that many people are that deeply empathetic. And she said that she thought it came from a couple of places, but most likely and earliest, when she was 2 years old, her older sister, Marilyn, died. She was 6 years old at the time. Marilyn was 6. And she died of meningitis. And Ruth said, I didn't know her. I don't remember her. I don't have memories of her. I was only 2 years old at the time. But I remember my parents' very deep grief over losing a child. And I think all of us who are parents know there probably isn't any other deeper grief than that. And that she feels is what made her so empathetic, because she could feel for her parents, even at a very young age, their sadness. And then, of course, her own mother dying at 17, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was only 17, that she learned sort of an early empathy. And I think that is such an important characteristic. And as Amy was saying earlier, with our kind of 5 characteristics of folks who are authentic leaderships, right? Purpose with passion. Goodness knows she had extraordinary purpose. And she did that with such passion. Again, if you've ever read any of her writings, if you've ever watched any of the films where she herself is speaking, I think you see that her extraordinarily solid values. She just knew who she was from a very early age. She was very clear about what she needed, whether that was in her partnership with Marty, whether that was in her friendships with people like Justice Scalia, whether that was in her need to give back, as she certainly did to so many others, including all of her law clerks and other people that she mentored along the way. Jeffrey Rosen wasn't even a clerk for her. He was a clerk for a different justice at the Court of Appeals, leading with heart. And Amy said this so well at the very beginning, but that empathy, that deep ability to connect with other people personally in front of large groups, even as a Supreme Court justice, she listened very carefully. If you listen to her talk, you will hear the pauses. She is a very careful and very deep thinker. I think that comes from obviously her legal background, but also just an incredible thoughtfulness in terms of her own life. And then this ability to establish connected relationships. As Amy said, that's one of the joys of our job here working with students without question. But certainly that had to have been one of the greatest joys of her legal career, was her ability to give back to others, both young women and young men. You can see many women and male law clerks there, how much she wanted to encourage others to go into a legal career, how much passion she had for it herself. Many, many, many deep friendships, some famous like with Justice Scalia and Nina Totenberg of NPR, but certainly many, many, many others. Her number of deep and connected friendships was legendary. And that's certainly something we should all aspire to it and try to have ourselves. And then, as I've said over and over and over again, and we certainly started with saying, this 5th characteristic of authentic leadership, this ability to demonstrate tremendous self-discipline. I'm not sure any of us could possibly mimic Ruth Bader Ginsburg's self-discipline, the ability to sometimes only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night. I know for myself, I need my 8 hours, but this ability to be so able to focus on whatever the work in front of her was, whether it was time with her children, her grandchildren, who later gave her so much joy in her life, her granddaughter, of course, becoming a lawyer herself and doing great work for human rights and voting rights very recently. But all of these things together, I think, made up such an extraordinary life for all of us to learn the lessons from, and particularly connect back to this idea of being authentic leaders. It's hard. It's very difficult to do. I think everyone knows that, whether you're a student leader on our campus, whether you're a leader in your own communities as a volunteer, whether you're a leader in your own careers, and many of us, hopefully, in our own lives, trying to be models for others. But there's no way to possibly become what Justice Ginsburg was, but what an extraordinary life, an extraordinary example for us. And I have many more stories that I've learned about her, obviously, from all the reading that I have done. But I wanted to share a few of those with you that maybe you haven't heard before. And Amy will kind of bring us into the next part of our presentation today.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. We're so fortunate to have Lisa on campus with her work she does day in and day out with students, but then to be an expert, particularly in a number of women leaders. Like, it's awesome to see. One question that I want to say has already come in that we touched on from our own wonderful colleague, Katie Flowers. How do we keep her legacy alive for the younger generations? Well, we're doing that right now. I know I'm hoping to get Lisa to come into my class next spring to talk about RBG and what an authentic leader. I predict that going forward, for someone like myself, as a leadership educator, we will be talking about her on the Mount Rushmore of leaders, particularly with all the progress we were able to make in and around her work on the Supreme Court. So here are a couple questions that Lisa and I wanted to just touch on. And just so the audience knows, I often tackle these with students when we're talking about authentic leadership. Do we have fewer today is an interesting question. I've seen students wrestle with this. Sometimes they struggle to find role models. We're living through a very divisive time, particularly politically. So finding those role models for our students is a challenge. They often turn to social media as an example where it's not especially real or truthful or honest. People leading fake lives. So some of them would say we're less authentic because we're so social media oriented. And it takes usually our alums, there are moments where they get to speak with mentors from our own network where we can open up the door and say, it really is about being yourself as a person, personally as well as professionally. And so how do you take steps when you graduate and move into your career to maintain that authenticity? It's really for those of us who go forward to lift people back, these college students, as they're trying to imagine what that looks like. Lisa, do you have any comments on that first question?
Yeah, I think the easy answer would be, of course, we have fewer today, but I don't know that that's so true, because when you look at particularly a lot of young people and their use of social media, some of it is difficult, but a lot of it is pretty impressive, right? Their ability to sort of showcase who they are through their social media in many positive and good ways. So I think they're trying so hard to be authentic and true to who they are. And I'm hoping that this generation of young people that we have now, once they learn some of that self-discipline, Amy was talking about the beginning, hard for all of us, of course, that they will get to that point, where they are able to really be true to themselves and true authentic leaders. But one of the reasons why I like Amy's definition so much, that she has from that wonderful book, True North, this idea of purpose with passion. I think a lot of people of all ages have tremendous purpose in their life that they feel very passionate about. And I think those of us who are lucky enough to have that in our careers, whether now, whether in the future, whether we're retired and it's more in the past for us, or with the end of our careers, we're really fortunate to do that. And then this idea of having solid values, that's probably the thing that gets tested a lot for many people. It makes it more challenging probably to be more authentic, but leading with heart. I definitely think I see this in students every day. Their heart is so much in the right place, and just learning how to channel that wonderful energy that they have, I think will lead them to really good places. And they really do value connecting in relationships. They just have to figure out how to balance the way to do that virtually, which they're quite good at. And of course, thankfully in this last year, they are good at that, because so many of us have had to learn to do that ourselves, haven't we? I mean, I would rather be with my parents than talking with them on Zoom or on the phone. I'm sure many of you would as well. But that idea of the connected relationships, I think, is really important as well. And then all of us always learning self-discipline. But I think, it's easy to say we don't have as many authentic leaders today because it's such a difficult climate. But I actually think we got a lot of people really striving to do that in their everyday lives. Do you agree, Amy? Or
I do. I think the pendulum is swinging back where We're especially deeply appreciative of realness, like transparency, honesty, those kinds of values. And when those emanate from leaders, that's the magnetic gravitational pull that leads us to follow individuals, if I were to be clear about that. Are there more barriers to being authentic? I think there's a lot to unpack regarding this question. Oftentimes in the class that I teach, we're talking about all of our responsibilities to build inclusive environments, and how not everybody is able to be their true self, largely because of the various identities and some of the discriminating forces we have. And so how very important it is that we model intense belonging is one way that I had a great student mention that. She said, it's not just about being diverse, but it's also, does everybody feel like they belong? And I find that very important if we're to be authentic. It's not always as easy for the person sitting next to me because of all the identities I carry. We unpack this with college students, and I know some of you alums that are on the call, you can appreciate how important that is to all of our working environments today, that we really consider what we're doing to be as inclusive as possible so that everybody can be authentic and their true selves. That's how we get the best potential. I think about my role as a supervisor when I'm trying to pull out potential from my staff members. Like, I want them to really feel like they can be authentic personally and professionally when they come to work. Did you have some thoughts on that, Lisa?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how much we need to listen, right? And how hard that can be, particularly as I was saying earlier, this relationship that Justice Ginsburg had with Justice Scalia, and they were really on opposite ends of the political spectrum, as I think most folks know, about many things, and yet they really listened carefully to each other. They respected each other deeply. And so I think if we can give that to each other, we will find it's easier to allow others to be authentic. Because if you're not really listening and wanting to hear what another person has to say, particularly if you assume that they feel a little differently than you on an issue, it makes it harder for them to become authentic. It makes it harder for them to be their true self to you. You have to create that space, as you said so well, Amy, I think, to be able to do that. And so it's hard right now to listen to other people, particularly if they don't agree with us on certain things, but that ability to find common ground, but also to listen to what's different about the other person's experience, right, is so important. And I find that with my students. Many of them have different lived experiences than I do. There are some things we certainly have in common, but not everything. And my ability to try always to challenge myself, which I'm doing every day and learning more about every day, to really listen and hear them and what their experience is more important than them hearing me and whatever advice they might have come to me for. I think that helps them learn how to be more authentic. And it's hard. It can be hard both ways, I think, right? It can be hard to share who we are, and it can be hard to listen to things that don't resonate with our own experiences. But given our job, right, Amy, you and me particularly, is to help raise and grow authentic leaders. That's what we do here at the colleges, or certainly should be doing. I think that can be sometimes one of the more of the challenges. But I think our students are often showing us the way, and they're figuring it out, right? And learning is painful. I know it was for me in college. The dean there would certainly tell you those stories. But you have to kind of find your way, and you have to try out different things, and you need people who are going to be supportive of that, even if they don't always agree with you.
Yeah, that's great. And last, this third question: how can we cultivate our own authentic leadership? I have a pretty short answer to this. In my experience, it's self-reflection, which is not easy, given the busyness of our lives. Especially, and Lisa knows this, we frequently work with students that are taking on multiple roles on campus, balancing their coursework and all that they want to do, because there's so many opportunities here at HWS. Carving out time where you're reflective about the experiences you're gaining, both positive and negative, and learning. That's how you become who you are. I've spent many years at the college level helping students come to understand that, but that's huge, even as we go on into our professional lives as we get older. as a working parent, this has been one of the hardest items to find time for, especially coming out of a year like we've had collectively post what our COVID experience has been like, to carve out some self-reflection to see how we've grown or changed, what that's meant to us. Couldn't be more important to being authentic. That book we keep referring to, True North, is really storying and reflecting all those leaders' experiences. And that's what Lisa kind of has done for us, the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But we all need to do that for ourselves if we're to take a step forward and to think about how we want to cultivate that capacity in our own selves. I force students to do this. Usually it's week 4. Some of my students on the call now, I had them do a scholarly personal narrative, which is an assignment I had to do in grad school, where you pick several components of scholarship and you weave it into your own personal story. And I think I'll do it every class I teach from here on out, because I've learned so much about the students that I then am working with for the rest of the semester. What they told me, how forthcoming and authentic they were in that paper assignment, I'll never forget. And it's very important that, I say to them, that's got to be a daily practice, that we find time to carve out that reflection in order to be authentic.
Yeah, I love that. I'm also thinking about different people who are on the call with us today, and how important, as I was saying earlier, the relationship of your life partner is, and how that ability to kind of know better who you are as a leader, as a person. Leadership can be defined in so many different ways, as I think most of us know, is really important. And sort of finding a mirror there to kind of help you be your very best self. And I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life with her husband is a great example of that. They did that for one another, as I said earlier. I love the story about the fact that they learned early on that Ruth did not cook very well, and the children would prefer that their dad cooked most of the meals. And she said that it was a little difficult at first for her to accept that, having grown up with certain gender roles, that she as the mother should have been the one kind of cooking dinner sometimes, but that probably the family would all be better off with that. And so there was a reflection from her family to her about what her best characteristics were. And that's a big part of being authentic, isn't it? It's playing to our strengths. And it's sometimes the people who live with us and the people who know us best who are able to tell us what our strengths are and what they are not. And I think that's a big part of it. I see some of you laughing about that, but I think it's really true. But every day is a challenge for all of us, isn't it? To be authentic to who we are. And you don't have to agree with everything that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, career was about, but I think a lot of her life, outside of politics, outside of her legal opinions, was a lot about early challenges in her life that helped her early on to define who she was and what was going to be important to her, not just issues, but her life's work, as an attorney, as a lawyer, as a person that made such a difference. My undergraduate degree is from Rutgers University. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is very famous there for having started the Women's Law Center at the law school in Newark, New Jersey, which was one of the only places she could get a job. Here she was, top of her class out of, at that point, then Columbia Law School, where of course she transferred because she wanted to be with her husband after he had gotten a job in New York City, since he was a year ahead of her in law school. She couldn't finish at Harvard, and so she finished at Columbia, top of her class, tied for top at Columbia Law School, could not get a job anywhere in New York City. And again, if you've seen On the Basis of Sex, you know that part of her story. And Rutgers hired her as a law professor, and she started the Women's Law Center there because her students asked her to, because her students were asking issues about gender and the law for both men and women. And that's another thing I just wanted to make sure to remind everyone of, that many of her earliest cases that set the law for gender equality in the workplace and in personal lives were on behalf of male clients who were being discriminated against because of laws that were meant to protect women were hurting men. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So she constantly talked not just about the importance of the law for women's equality, but for all people's equality, for parents, whether they were men or women. And I think that's an important thing to remember about her and who she was as an authentic person. She wanted one of the pictures in her chambers at the court was of her son, her grown son, James, with his son, who was just a couple months old. And the way that he was looking at his son and wanting to have time with his son and be part of raising him. And it was his mother, her daughter-in-law, who took the picture. And she said she loved that picture because that's what she wanted as the future, that both men and women as parents would feel they could equally be a part of their children's lives growing up. So I just love that part of who she was. But we have a couple of questions. So if we want to start there, Amy started with the legacy question. Thanks, Katie Flowers, for asking that of us in advance. I think, we all can be a part of keeping her legacy alive. Again, thinking of it in this framework of authentic leadership, which Amy has done so well. And then someone had asked about, did the film, in my opinion, and I guess Amy's too, Amy, you've seen it, I'm sure, right, On the Basis of Sex, did it accurately describe RBG's authentic self? And what do we think it might take for women to be seen as equal to men? And I think she certainly took the law a long way, in some of those things. But I like her answer, which is when women and men both feel equally able, right, to have access to careers, to have access to promotions, to have access to the ability to stay home and care for their children if they want to, regardless, because of equal pay. And I think many of men's lives, many fathers in particular lives, are shaped because they needed to be the primary breadwinner in their families when their children were growing up, because their wives would not have made as much money as Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself experienced early in her career. And I think her idea of equality, and it's certainly mine as well, I would say, is when everyone has equal opportunities, in their personal lives, with their children, with their families, with their ability to balance work and family, which was really important to her, and certainly in their careers, that there's true equal access for everyone, and everyone has that ability, and that women and men both are mentors to each other. I think that's very important. I certainly am a mentor, try to be to a lot of young women, but I also love doing that for young men as well, and I'm happy when they ask me. So I think that's part of it. In terms of the film, I think one thing to remember about On this Basis of Sex is that it was actually her nephew who wrote the screenplay. And so he very much wanted to make sure it was something she'd feel good about. She felt it was very authentic to that part of her life. I think if you've seen it, there's one love scene between her and Marty when they're very young. And he said that was the hardest part of it for him to write. And he turned to his aunt and said, was this okay? He was kind of horrified to be watching that with her. And she said, yeah, that's pretty good. She gave it the thumbs up. So, but it is just one part of her life, one case that she was particularly focused on. So, obviously there's some liberties taken there, but she felt that it was pretty accurate. So I guess I'd have to agree with the justice on that.
And I'll just add, because it's a large question. How do women? What will it take for women to be seen as equal? We need more women leaders, don't we? And I know Lisa and I take deep responsibility in terms of the work we do with our own student population. And it's not for me to tell them what work to go into, but please pick meaningful work that's making a contribution positively to society. We need more leaders like you out there doing the work. And especially so, this is one of those scenarios, one of those problems, and that we all need to be pressing, whatever our role is. How can we create more equity in our systems, in our organizations, in our communities? Particularly, I know I feel strongly about this, that really allow women to flourish and thrive, professionally speaking, but also balance what they need to personally. So I think that's a large challenge. But I encounter students all the time that I'm like, wow, that's the one that's going to really transform the next organization or the community leader or whatever role they're moving into. And I know that many of our alums are also making those contributions too. It's for all of us to take responsibility for this younger generation, because most of our challenges today are deeply connected, and this is one of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that intersectionality is a really good point. And we had a question come in about that too. We don't have quite enough time to go into that in depth, but this ability that everything's kind of connected to everything else. students often ask me what my major was in college because they, of course, it could have been anything being in the job that I'm in now. But I was a political science major in college at Rutgers, and I did go work in Washington for several years in politics, as many folks know. And one of the things I learned as an undergraduate in political science is that everything is a system. Everything is connected to everything else, right? And so when one group is furthered, other people are furthered by that. We are not all competing for one small slice of the pie. You know, and most of us have multiple identities that are important to us. You know, some of us were the first person in our family to go to college. Some of us, you know, grew up in a family where we had teachers for parents and really admire what teachers do and had other parts and roles in our lives, but always have that with us for the rest of our careers, regardless of what we do. And so all these different ways of looking at the world, whether it's through the lens of race or class or gender or so many other things, you know, this idea of everything being connected to everything else, all of us being in a system together with one another, and then we all kind of rise and fall together. And I think there's a really important lesson in that. And I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg understood this in terms of putting these pieces in place with the law to create a system that was better. And this is this idea that we live in a democracy, right? And that we are always making it better. And we are always forging a more perfect union, as the founder said, right? This idea that we can always be better than what we are, that we as people can always be better than what we are as authentic leaders, in this case of this webinar, that we as a country can always be better in our ability to listen to one another, to find the things that we have in common, and that we can always be striving to be something more than what we are now. And I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg, with her extraordinary self-discipline, her way of being able to focus, her deep empathy, her extraordinary mind, and the choices that she made in her life about her life partner, about her children, about her career, about mentoring others. I think we can all learn from that and all strive to be something more than maybe what we are today, regardless of what career we're in, regardless of where we are in stage of life, we can all be more. And I know Amy joins me in thanking all of you because I see we're just about out of time. Amy, last words?
No, I mean, you said it really well. I guess I would hope that everybody spends some time thinking through the last several months, and that is a significant way to take steps towards being your most authentic self. And I'm deeply grateful we could do this together, Lisa. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alumni House, for organizing this. Wonderful to see all your faces. Please enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we're glad you could be with us today. Thank you so much, and thanks to our colleagues in Advancement for setting this up for us.